Welcome to the 56th episode of the interview series. The interview series is a publication of 1 Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. Please like and subscribe to help us continue producing excellent content. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Dr. Eleanor Swanson, whose poem H.G. Wells Reimagines Time Travel was featured as a past teaching takeaway, a 1 week critique series exploring how a poem is put together line by line. Eleanor Swanson is a widely published poet and fiction writer who holds a PhD from the University of Denver. As a professor in the Regis University English department, she focused on teaching environmental literature and the literature of social justice and social change. Her first poetry collection, A Thousand Bonds, Marie Curie and the Discovery of Radium, won the Ruth Stevens Award, NFSP Press, and was a finalist for the Colorado Book Award. And her second collection of poetry, Trembling in the Bones, was reissued in 2013 by Taos Press. Her third poetry collection is Memories Rooms from Conundrum Press. There it is. Her fourth poetry collection, Non Finito, was recently released by Fernwood Press. She is also a fiction writer who has published a novel and 2 collections of short stories. Her second collection, Exiles and Expatriates, won the Press Americana Prize. You can learn more about Eleanor on her website at eleanorswanson.com. Hello, Eleanor. I'm so glad we have the opportunity to discuss Non Finito and Trembling in the Bones. I'll start by thanking my mentor, Dr. Angela Ball, a professor at the University of Southern Mississippi, who put us in touch. Angela, the patron saint of book blurbs, had this to say about Non Finito. With lingering amplitude, Non Finito curates and magnifies the beauties of the stubbornly incomplete, demonstrating the elegance of processes ongoing, the moment by moment ravishments of life, scarce bearable loss, and of the art that preserves all. An affirming statement about writing appears in your opening poem, As the Dreamer Waits, in which I, the poet, produce the place, the sense, the temple, the blossoms whose petals shine in the sun. Production is an ever-going enterprise. Your book's preface inviting the reader to consider the beauty and vitality to be found in things unfinished. Could you start by reading a poem so we have your words in the air, then talk about the confluences that drew you to a book-length project, Adorning the Undone?
Yes, I'll read Walking Colfax Avenue. And this was written in memory of Jake Adam York, who died young unexpectedly of a stroke. It's not quite twilight when I step from the bus into a crowd of revelers. The streets are cordoned off, encircled by yellow tape. The buses can't go east, so I walk and walk on, leaving visions behind me. Most disturbingly, a joker, and not the dead Heath Ledger, but one of old, in yellow and red, with a belled hat. A hand beckons me from a dark doorway, framed by bare wood, leading into a darker place that more hands, shadowy hands, wave from, leaving pale vestiges. I hear a song with the repeating verse, the singer's voice harsh, then harsher. But as I walk, the voice drifts away on the wind. The twilight is deeper now, thick as soup. I will never be alone on this street, the longest in the whole of the United States, in the world. If the universe had streets, well, Non Finito gives us with an understanding of infinity. I'm going to attribute for a poet whose work was unfinished. His words unravel, becoming codas, enveloped in the unyielding darkness. Walking Colfax Avenue. So that tells you a little bit there about Non Finito, the poem itself. Can I say any more about it now?
Of course.
Well, I would like to quote myself then. I might do that more than once, but in the preface, which you quote from already, it says, the poems focus on the worlds of the seen as well as the unseen worlds, exploring what is real and what is merely fancied. Well, that's it. And there's more to be said about it as we move through the interview.
Thank you for those insights.
Surely.
The questions asked in I Love You, Says the Heart include, and this is probably one of my favorites because I am all about the physics. What does a quark look like? What was the message in the unopened letter you burned? And who wears the shoes with the pattern of radio waves on their soles? These are illustrative of our nature to query, especially amplified when considering the state of non finito. As an example, what if Schubert's Eighth Symphony or his chamber music piece, Quartet Satz, was actually finished? Would we treasure these pieces more or simply relegate them to the composer's catalog? Your work has helped me reassess your resolution, which is now a welcome guest in my composition notebook that I've called The Big 2023 Poem. Actually started it on January 2nd, 2023. So I'm now about a month and a half into this big, unwieldy work that I've framed as an offspring of the cantos and Trivial Pursuit. But that subject for another year. I'm still embracing this concept of irresolution at every stage of the process of my writing of it. So what would you say to writers who might bristle at accepting the tabula that's jettisoned the rasa, having no intention of crossing the line of what we define as complete?
As artists, I say that would be their choice, but perhaps they are missing out on some mysteries and unfinished things.
Excellent. And I still go back to those, the radio waves on the soles and the quark, such original imagery. And I, as someone who's been wearing Vans and Chuck Taylors for many, many years, I always think about, well, those little diamond patterns on the shoes. And then you've got those, it's usually those CSI programs where it's either the tire treads or the shoe patterns that are giving away the criminal. And but yet we have, again, radio waves on the soles of shoes.
Right, right, right.
Your
And
poems,
corpse.
I just love them because they're peopled with such personnel as Pablo Neruda and Jerry Garcia, as well as more obscure individuals, including Nanda Devi Unsold, who died during a mountain hiking expedition at the age of 22, and Harry R. Truman, who at 84 stayed on Mount St. Helens the day it erupted. In Standing Dead Zone, Mount St. Helens, you write, after the blast, dark smoke would block the sun. He and his cats and the lodge would be buried under mud and ash. They'd never find him. He'd be part of the mountain forever. He'd lived here all his life, and he'd die here too, standing like the trees, still standing when the blast came, watching the last morning sun glaze the valley with dusty light. I feel that figures like Harry are actually the opposite of unfinishedness. How did you determine the placement of these contrasts throughout Non Finito?
Well, interestingly enough, the book has sections. So I kind of help myself in sectioning particular poems into groups. But Harry Truman is an emblem of showing us deliberately a complete life. He had a complete life. But I wanted to read a poem, since you asked for a contrast. I wanted to read a poem on page 37 of Non Finito. It's about the boy who fell through ice. And I think you'll see, page 37, how it is standing in contrast to Harry Truman. In an interesting, I would say, I don't want to use the word too often, a mystical way, a spiritual way, even. And here we go, 37. And this is the last stanza. What did he see while he was under the ice? He never described to anyone, never could describe that whiff he'd caught, that minute trace of something numinous, unnameable, yet forever sought after. That's Non Finito. And it's not the same life or experience that we see in the Harry Truman poem. So it stands in contrast with Harry Truman. That's it.
You know, I was actually just thinking about this poem, Vestige, 2 days ago because in Michigan at the time it was pouring rain and the temperature had dropped below freezing. Because you have this image in the second stanza, clothes freezing already. He'd walk home like that in his armor of ice. And sure enough, when I got home, my umbrella was pretty much armored up with all the raindrops that had just frozen. And then you also have that the star-shaped hole he'd made and fallen through. And then when we end, you've got those two long U sounds, minute and numinous. And then we have the contrast with that short U, the unnameable, yet forever sought after. Section
You got a
3.
lot of assonance there.
You know me, I love color coding the assonance. I love color coding the alliteration. It's when I do those teaching takeaways,
Yes.
and it's usually just at the book form, it's all about the underlining and sometimes drawing the stars, especially the hearts when there's such awesome alliteration. So thank you. There are many hearts and underlines and stars went into this book on my end, and we'll find out more about your process of the drafting of it in a few
Okay.
questions later. So,
Okay.
and see, the wonderful thing about section 3 is that it has the poems that affected me the most. Bella among
All
them,
right.
where a woman looks for a lost dog in a cemetery less pristine than you'd expect. Fearing the worst, but I saw no dead dog, just refuse, soda and beer cans, cigarette butts, fast food wrappers, leaves and twigs. The lack of cleanliness as reverence for the deceased got to me. Formally, in section 3, you include a list piece of events in the poem titled This Day in History, September 2nd, a gift that keeps on giving, prompt, since you can lens it locally, globally, and personally. Next, you join the poems Summer of the Hawks and My Mother's Ghost through birds and word mirroring, the former's rosy finch, the latter's dusky rose, and a matriarch who can fly away in the guise of a sparrow whenever she wishes. Last but not least, there's nature's Millennium Marathoners, the horseshoe crabs in I Set Them Aright. After 200 million years, after creeping among dinosaurs and regarding with their double eyes the last mastodon falling away to bone, they won't soon pass into extinction. Harmless, they neither sting nor pinch, but who would want them anyway? To what degree does linkage factor into your drafting process?
Well, I answer that by saying to a substantive degree. That's why the collection is divided into sections. Each one has an epigraph, which tells you something about Non Finito, and moreover tells you implicitly about each section.
So now we come to section 4, which has the poem Landmine Museum, and it features this 2-word sentence, serenity, unflinching. This concept I apply to your poem, The Garden, with its non-traditional metamorphosis in the following passage. Sometimes I sat on a folding chair under a little spruce that had long been in the backyard, remembering that someone once said of the poet Andrew Marvell that he was a butterfly turned caterpillar. I'm thinking sereneness is the ability to rewind a cocoon. How do you apply unflinching serenity to revision?
Well, that's an interesting question because I don't. I don't think of or typically feel serene. The way that I feel is most often I feel anxiety when I'm revising a poem. Maybe if I have reached a point where I have revision after revision after revision, then I can feel like, oh, I've really accomplished something that will allow me to say this poem isn't non finito, but it's at the moment as complete as I can make it. So that can produce serenity. but it's most often just anxiety. But I'm kind of an anxious person, I have to say.
I am as well. And what I'm trying now with my revision process is to actually give things about a month to 2 months before they're all on my desktop, right? And they're always backed up. They're either on a little thumb drive or I will email myself a Word document as soon as I've composed it. But I'm giving myself now that 30 to 60-day policy. And the goal is that maybe if there are poems that I've read or some stories or some essays, maybe some of those takeaways will have gotten my revisionary processes on a different track than what I used to do, which was as soon as I would write the poem, put it away for a day or two, share it with some friends, get it ready for workshop submission, and then immediately start revising after the workshop based on feedback or based on, as I was reading it out loud, what did I stumble over? What felt like it was just completely unoriginal? But now I'm trying to be more of a forgiving reviser. I am trying for that serenity, and I'm trying to be an unflinching reader of my work and editor of my work. It's easy. I unflinch with others. Just it's a perfect process. But for the self, it's always that unflinching of the self that gets me caught up. And now,
I can learn from you.
oh, trust me, I'm learning from these books daily. This is probably the third reading that I've done of
Boy,
Non Finito. I'm on the second reading. You see the Mississippi Review bookmark. Got to give a shout out to my old alma mater. But it's just wonderful that these books are now a part of how I think about the making of poetry and how I think about, okay, getting into that serene atmosphere of setting the work aside 30 days, 60 days, coming back to it. Yes, there's always that anxiety of how do I get it to that next level, but maybe just turning the tap, having a little bit more of a lukewarm relaxation mode to it instead of just this hyper specificity of that just that can sometimes just freeze your process in place, or you feel like you're boiling the poem down if the tap's too hot. So that's the beauty of technology, the old school plumbing. Now we turn to some 21st century technology where I'm going to share an early draft of what becomes the poem A Man Tries His Hand at Building a Flagstone Path. Get the old shared screen magic going.
I don't have that on screen, but oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah.
There's one little typo there. Fast Eddie. Fast
Okay.
Eddie of the Unfinished House is.
Okay.
Did you want me to read both of these poems?
Sure, if you could do that, please. And then um, after that, if you could just walk us through your revision decisions.
Oh, absolutely. Uh, Fast Eddie of the Unfinished House is on the deck of the unfinished porch of the unfinished house, slumped in a red canvas chair. He appears to be nodding off, or contemplating his crotch, or looking at the bare wood planks of the unfinished deck. I should have a stanza break there, but this is a draft. One day I saw him without a shirt. It was a really hot day. There was a power outage, and I made a neighborly stop at his door to tell him a crew was at work nearby. He wore a Confederate flag tattoo on his chest and swastikas on his biceps. As I said, it was a hot day, as it is today. But that afternoon, he saw the look on my face, and he won't be taking off his shirt again. So, I wrote a draft, and then I said, well, I'm not really trying to attack anyone, or but all of that happened exactly the way that I said. Well, the noise, I mean, they did an addition next door, And he did. He scraped and dug but the whole thing about the tattoos, that really happened. So I said, what are you going to do to write another poem and see if you can do something that's more philosophically, I don't know what the word is, empathetic? No, it isn't. I didn't really feel empathy. Um, but here's the poem on 66, if you want to put that on.
Sure.
Uh, Man tries his hand at building the Flagstone Path. He carries the level and the measuring tape, looking closely at each piece of flagstone before he places it in the hard clay that he's been trying to smooth out for days, running his backhoe over it again and again, scrape, beep, beep, and repeat, fraying his nerves to thin wires that would give off sparks if they touched. He lays a stone, then another, moving them closer with his shoe, as if that would work. Intractable stone on clay, hard as the stone itself. The path begins to curve toward a driveway, and then he makes a spiral. Perhaps he is thinking maze or labyrinth or nebula. The temperature has climbed into the 90s. The man sweats, steps back, and looks at the path, the spiral. He looks long and hard, and again pushes one stone toward another with the toe of his boot. Then he walks up to a stone strip, to another with the toe of his boot. Then he walks up to a stone step onto his unfinished deck. He walks up to a stone, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, and sits in a chair, seeming to stare at the street. His hands dangle between his knees. His jaw goes slack. He imagines that the path, if finished, would take him somewhere, out into the vast universe, perhaps, or at least out of the cauldron heat, take him away from his unspeakably futile task. Well, that's it. If I hadn't gotten to these final words, the poem would be pretty much meaningless. It would have some meaning. I mean, it talks about someone who's repeated a task, and if you don't have the draft, you don't need the draft, because this is my poem now. It's mine. I have taken possession of what happens in this poem. And what happens in this poem is he imagines that the path, if finished, would take him somewhere, out into the vast universe, perhaps, or at least out of the cauldron heat, take him away from his unspeakably futile task. Well, that's it. I mean, if you didn't have anything else to say about the poem, it's about people who try to complete unspeakable tasks, which we as artists hope to do better than that. So that strikes a contrast between this man as someone who is remodeling his house and us as artists, poets, and we don't want our tasks to be unspeakable. We want to be able to talk about them and have people listen. And so I think that tells you how it gets from the draft, where he's kind of hideous. I don't know if you think someone wearing racist tattoos is hideous. He just is. He's just a man. And is he a racist? Yeah, yes, but he's human. and I wanted him not to be depicted as anything but human in the final draft. So there you have it.
Thank you.
You bet.
What's also interesting, I just picture that cauldron heat and what that might do to those awesome shoes that have those radio waves on the soles. So I just that would be some surrealist shoe factory magic right there.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Okay.
Refraction is a poem set during October where most of the leaves have fallen, but the leaves on the maples still flame red as custom sports car red, red as an image from an illuminated manuscript. The penultimate stanza tells of a party when we met, costumed, disguised at Halloween, Quasimodo and Amelia. The makings of my masquerade were too vague for you to know. I was the famous Earhart, but I understood that your hump was emblematic of pain. As a Libra, I flocked to October writings. And the bonus here being the Lon Chaney places my mind goes, because you have that Quasimodo. So right away, I'm back in the 1920s silent films. And then Amelia, who, if we think about this concept of unfinishedness, she is our unfinished aviatrix. What are the permissions that come with bringing recognizable people into poems? And what about restrictions?
Well, maybe I'm not thoughtful, but I really don't think about the need for permissions. I really don't think that there are restrictions, because it's partly because I've written so many poems that are persona poems. And if I had to ask permission, I would never get any poems finished. I think in particular, and that's not really a good example, but of Trembling in the Bones. And Trembling in the Bones is persona poems. And I had to make it up because the people at Ludlow, the men and women there, mostly did not speak English. And they certainly didn't write letters and leave that kind of legacy. So not all of them. And if you read the book, which you have, you'll know that people did write memoirs, but for the most part, they didn't. And so I guess I don't mean to be thoughtless, but I guess I just want to capture the lives that I can capture the way I can best capture them. And that's definitely true in Trembling in the Bones.
Great. Early in the collection, you have the poem Chamber at the End of the Mind, and it has a first stanza so ornate, its ingredients vibrate at masterpiece frequency. And I'll read some of it. I saw a white pelican floating in the coolness of the lake, like the swan of dream time, with dragonflies flitting beside her, full of messages about the universe's rhythms, such as those of the binary star Alberio, the head of the swan in the constellation Cygnus, one of the 48 Ptolemy included in his famous list of constellations. Are there any poems you can think of whose opening stanzas reverberated with you to such an extent that it became your mission to obtain any and all books by the author at hand?
Thank you, first of all, for your complimentary view of this poem. Which, what does it mean? I think I know. I think I know what it means. But any poems, I especially like W.S. Merwin. Now, collected poems, I have read most of his collected poems, and there are others. I mean, I'm trying to think of more contemporary writers. I have some books that are on their way, so maybe I'll be able to answer better when I get those. But yeah, the author at hand. And I'll be talking about Linda Hogan in a few minutes here. So I especially like Merwin. I especially like, who else do I especially like? I could tell you if I had more time to think about it. Thank you for asking.
Sure. You know, when I think of Merwin, I think of the lice. And, you know, if I'm remembering the research that I did on it, it was on the comps list. So of course that got reds and annotated and punctuation lists. If I'm remembering correctly, those were written around the time of the Vietnam War. And
Yeah, yes. He was writing, as you can read, not even have to read between the lines, in protest of the war.
mhm, yeah.
He was quite a poet and a human.
And then I remember I read Linda Hogan, I believe it's The Woman Who Watches Over the Worlds,
Oh,
in
sure.
a memoir class at USM, and it would have been my first year, and that was quite powerful as well. And I'm especially, I think there was that aspect where she had the traumatic closed head injury.
Oh, yeah, she spent a long time recovering from that,
Mhm.
falling
Well,
from a horse.
we shift now to Trembling in the Bones, which for me was an early January read, side by side with Anthony Cody's Borderland Apocrypha and Carl Phillips's My Trade is Mystery, 7 Meditations from a Life in Writing. Whereas I experienced Phillips' book like a writer's retreat, Cody's collection is a work of docupoetics, investigations. These beyond poems, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, Mexican Indian lands, the untold occupations of America, as Juan Felipe Herrera's prefatory words state. The subject of Trembling's docupoetics pertains to, and I quote from Veronica Golos's Haunted by History, an introduction, evidence about mining in the southern fields of Colorado, the strike of 1913, and the Ludlow massacre of 1914. Do you see the research aspects of Trembling in the Bones as prelude to the scope of detail that went into Non Finito?
Well, I can't say really yes to that because I do a considerable amount of research on every book, every single book. I mean, I've had students tell me, "Oh, I don't do any research to write my poems." And I say, "Why not? Don't you think it will help you find larger context?" But I'm not sure that I always bother to say that because if they say I don't do any research, or the other thing they'll say is, I never do more than one draft. I figure, and if it sounds cruel, that I don't have anything more to say to them. Does it sound cruel? Um, I try to encourage them. I say, really, revision, which of course we're talking about today, it can't hurt you. It can't hurt you. It can only make your poem better. Well, I think it's fine the way it is. And I can't argue with that. I can say, well, just try a revision. And if they do, they do. And sometimes they do. And now I'm going to interrupt myself here and say I really want to read these books that you've referenced because I do not know them. I don't. So I'm interested in reading them. I'm getting
Oh,
I'm getting a pile of books that I need to read.
they're
And
phenomenal books.
oh, I'm sure the prefatory words state, okay, this is Trembling. So starting with my novel, which is set in Florida, which was written a long time ago, but um, especially the book on Marie Curie. I mean, I didn't know anything really about her. And people ask me, well, why did you start writing about her? And I said, because I started writing about her. And my husband said, you've written these poems. Why don't you write a book? And I said, that's a good idea. And she and her life as a scientist. And I'm friends with a couple of chemists, one of whom is my husband, who could help me with the chemistry uh, in that book. But she was a fascinating scientist who was hated. And I don't think that's too strong a word, not by everyone, but by fellow male scientists. And Einstein himself uh, didn't hate her, but he did not like her either. So there's a lot to discover when you do research and then you write poems like when Curie and Einstein are walking in Eglantine, and you have this context of them not really liking each other. I mean, he didn't like her, and I don't think she liked him that much, but I never would have known that if I hadn't done research.
Hmm.
So yes, research, and especially for Trembling in the Bones. You know, I found out kind of like you did one day, fairly long ago, before there was a big sign out there that says Ludlow. And so, same thing, we were traveling, I better get my directions right, south. And we said, well, why not stop in here and see what this is all about? And we didn't know. So one of the first things that I did, was to go into the pit. And that was it for me. I was so, I can feel it now. I was so moved by what happened there. I said, I have to write about this. And so my research commenced uh, by writing about what happened to Mary Petrucci and her children and what she came out to see on the day that she was the only survivor. So yes, I've done the research all the time.
Hmm.
And I know Jon knows that that's a book that's full of heartache. It's full of heartache. But I will have to say, and I think Jon probably knows this, but one of the things it's about is the strength of women and how they cook together, and they couldn't even speak. I knew the word for bread before I knew any other English word, because they cooked together and they survived while their mates and their husbands were out getting them food. And I'm always myself moved by the solidarity that we can see in those lives. That's what I can say about that.
And that's perfect because I'm remembering in that poem where they are just before they're going to read whether or not there is a settlement for all of the men who died in the mine and the boys. The narrator, I believe, takes the hand of the woman who cannot speak English, and is, there is that solidarity right there. And then we even see there's the mother of one of the Greek I believe, union leaders who has that foresight enough to actually send that native dirt and then
It's Ticus.
Tikas to then sew it into the shirt. And it's almost as if saying, this is always going to be a part of you. And then I believe they find him with, I think 3 bullets after one of the massacres. And
They shot him in the back.
hmm,
They shot Louis Ticus in the back when he was trying to help people in the camps. Don't make me cry.
okay, okay, I won't. Um, could you read Valley of Ashes in its entirety?
Uh-oh, I have the wrong poem. I have to find it. Valley of Ashes. I had Out of the Depths. I will find it. Sorry for the delay here.
Oh, no sweat.
Strike call.
I have it on page 48.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That will help me. Snow Child. There it is. 47. I don't know why I didn't have that mark. So it's interesting that when I talk about Trembling in the Bones, many students have never heard of this momentous historical event in our own state, Colorado. So I want them to know about that. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes and hope not to repeat myself. Valley of Ashes. The morning light is frail as the stalk of a lily, greenish as if ready to droop back into night and put out the sun. I've traveled all the way from my lush valley in Wales, a miner's daughter and now a miner's wife, staring out at anything green as far as I could see. Only rows of unpainted shacks, just a step between front stoop and dusty dirt street, gray as a layer of ashes in the feeble dawn. Back home, our company bungalow was built of native stone. Our valley ringed by mountains, wildflowers dotting the green meadow grass with 100 colors. As I watched the woman across the road scrub clothes on a big washboard, I began to cry. My little girls, my 2 little girls, are asleep, oblivious to the dirty light, the stretch of gray streets that will flow with mud in the spring. They don't yet hear the mine's machinery grating out the minutes, or the sound of cloth rubbed vigorously against corrugated metal. When they awake, I'll plait their hair without ribbons and dress them in gray as I begin to teach them to live without color. I will teach them not to miss trees or tender grass or flowers. They will learn to love their gray dresses and the landscape of dirt, rock, and brush. They will learn to see beauty in a diatom on a lump of coal or a dust phantasm rising in the sudden wind.
I love the sensorial sound of cloth rubbed vigorously against corrugated metal and the ending trifecta of beauty, coal, and dust. Just as the miners were exploited, so too did their families wither.
Yes.
How how did Trembling in the Bones expand your writerly empathy?
Um, let's see here. I have an answer to that. What really extended my writerly empathy was definitely Trembling in the Bones. Absolutely. But I also think of another book, and there are many, but I think of Fragments from the Fire by Llewellyn Chris, I believe is her name, and fragments of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire that happened March 25th, 1911. It's really a rough collection because 146 women died, and most of them were young Eastern European women. And what they did, if you read this book, you'll see, is the owners locked the doors. And when the fire began, they couldn't get out, and they jumped through windows, and most all of them died. It's sad, it's very sad, but it's another story of labor and what happens when people as laborers are exploited. It's awful, it's terrible. So Fragments from the Fire about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, March 25th, 1911.
If I'm also remembering correctly, in Non Finito, isn't there that poem about the people, the women in the sweatshop there's that earthquake, I believe?
Huh, you'll have to remind me.
Okay,
In Non Finito,
I believe so.
I'll pull it out here.
So I was just rereading it.
Okay. Maybe you could give me a page reference.
Sure, let's see.
Earthquake. Oh, you mean My Name is Rupa?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
sure.
Would you
No,
like to read that?
that's another one where
Mhm.
these people, mostly women, were completely exploited in this falling down factory. My name is Rupa. In April, I sat at my sewing machine holding the yoke of a shirt, a wrangler, mixed colors, a plaid fabric. I ran a seam. It takes two hands to make a shirt. Sure hands. No hesitating, for the bosses want the work done fast. My mother stood near me saying, we'd take breakfast together. We both worked at Rana Plaza. She made shorts and I made shirts. Later in the building's rubble, they'd find labels and piles of unfinished clothing. C&A, Benetton, Mango, Premac, Kane. The factory floor rolled beneath my feet. My mother vanished. That morning, we'd seen cracks in our building, but were told to enter or we would not be paid. I dropped the unfinished shirt and ran through thick dust screaming, "Save me! I'm alive! I am here! I am Rupa."
Such an effective poem, and the thought that, again, this is then that collection about the unfinished, and here we have that unfinished shirt, but then the unfinished lives of all those workers.
Who died. Yes, and I think it goes without saying that her mother died.
Mhm.
She vanished. She vanished.
Well,
Oh, I see. Yes, Out of the Depths. Okay. Oh, you quoted a couple lines from Out of the Depths. I see that.
all gratitude to you, Eleanor, for discussing your poetry today. And it was so great to hear these poems that I've been living with in my head, then to have you voice them out loud. And I'm so thrilled that Angela Ball brought us together. And then you've also worked with Andrea Watson of Taos
Yes,
Press,
yes,
as
yes.
have I. So it just seems like this interview was destined to Zoom. I actually recall Andrea telling me that Trembling in the Bones was once a book of the year for incoming first year students at Regis University. Could I add that if there was an award for extraordinary juxtapositions, I'd nominate your poem Out of the Depths based on
Okay.
these lines. In the dark, smelling gasoline and axle grease and listening for the whine of bullets. Sometimes all I heard was a meadowlark. Just those bullets and that meadowlark and that axle grease. I'll conclude with your academic interests, seeing
Okay.
that you taught courses on social justice and environmental literature. What were some of your assignments and primary texts in those classes?
Okay, well, you probably can guess that I did assign Trembling in the Bones, second edition. And so that was one. And also, Linda Hogan's novel, Mean Spirits,
Hmm.
is a beautifully written, spiritual, and ecological consciousness book. It's mystery. I think it's a mysterious book. And so I assigned that. And they could cross over into ecological or social justice. But those are the ones that I've used. And for good or not good, I've also used strictly for environmental reading and film is Into the Wild by John Krakauer. Now, John Krakauer, of course, wrote the book Into the Wild, and Sean Penn did the film. And I happen to think, for my purposes, the film is better than the book because you can really see things that you can kind of argue with, where he's showing the character with his arms spread out on the water like he's Christ. Well, I disagree with that, but it's something emblematic in that particular film that gives us in a classroom a lot to talk about. Do you think that the quote unquote hero of Into the Wild is like Christ? It's a question, especially if you know what happened to him. It's tragic.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple of things. I could think of a lot more, but that would get anyone started.
Well, I'm so glad we finally, again, we met on Zoom, and ever since I first started reading your poetry about maybe 11 months ago, when Angela again just said, "Hey, there's a poet's colleague of mine. Would you be interested in reviewing her work or even writing about it as far as an interview?" And then I was, as again, I have this physics, always this desire to know more about the sciences. And so that's why I was so captivated by your H.G. Wells poem, which became a teaching takeaway, and then just spent more time with all the poems and saw the project of Non Finito, and then just had to get Trembling in the Bones and what you're doing with the persona poems. There's so many heartbreaking moments because there's this optimism, this hope that I think there's one poem where the father's thinking about how he doesn't want his sons to have to do the same kind of work,
Right.
but yet how many of them are most likely wiped out in the massacre or through some sort of a cave-in. And
Right,
are,
right. Well, these men, especially in their home countries, were professional or semi-professional, like shoemakers, and then they're relegated to being common laborers. So that's
Mhm,
part of the story as well, and
mhm,
that's kind of what you see implicitly. And
mhm.
but I'm the one who needs to thank you and Angela, and profound gratitude, profound gratitude to both of you. And I'm going to write Angela this afternoon and tomorrow.
You're welcome. And Angela, again, she is the patron saint of book blurbs, and so many fond memories of her workshops. The last one I took with her, we had a cinematic theme where we were encouraged to incorporate cinema into our poems. And
Oh,
I think
nice. Good.
I found myself taking risks of bringing in, for example, some Fritz Lang pieces and even Steel Magnolias.
Oh,
So
sure. Okay.
you have like these high art 1920s metropolis, right? And then you jump all the way to the late 1980s, and you've got, Sally Field and Daryl Hannah, and somehow getting Daryl Hannah into a poem, maybe that's one achievement of my PhD life that I can, that and the degree, right? Just all to say that this whole environment that was opened up to me by Angela, and then the worlds that your work has opened up to me in terms of thinking about revision and having more patience as I undertake larger projects. Just non finito, that's the key to just everything that I know from my writing will help me in the weeks and months and years to come. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And
I want to end with a complete non sequitur, but I think you'll appreciate it because of what you said about Lon Chaney. For several semesters, I taught a course called The Living and the Dead, and it was about the vampire. And there's so much literature and film about the vampire, but it creeped me out. I had to stop teaching it. But anyway,
we could talk about that entirely. We could do another hour and a half on that, but time is precious for revising or just catching up on lesson plans or emailing old friends. So I will conclude with saying it's been an honor and a privilege, and so excited for whatever comes next in your poetry projects. Thank you again, Eleanor.
Thank you, and I'll keep you apprised of what I'm doing.
Great. Bye.
Bye.